Kale Maddox had been flying alone for 3 years, and he had learned one rule above all others. Never answer a distress beacon in the Veshan corridor, unless you wanted trouble to find you. But trouble had a way of finding Kale, whether he wanted it or not. He sat in the cockpit of his freighter, a beaten and scarred ship called the Long Walk, eating cold rations, and staring at the signal that blinked on his console like a heartbeat that refused to stop. The beacon was weak and buried under layers of interference, the kind of signal that someone had tried very hard to hide, and that fact alone made Kale lean forward in his chair and narrow his eyes. He ran a scan, and the results came back with a ship profile that made his stomach turn. A Dralvathi slave barge, registry scrubbed, engines dead, drifting through the dark like a coffin tossed into the sea. The Dralvathi Syndicate was the largest trafficking operation in the Outer Rim, a cartel so powerful that entire governments looked the other way when their ships passed through, and their slave barges were legendary for all the wrong reasons. Massive vessels, designed to carry hundreds of sentient beings in containment cells no bigger than closets, stacked like cargo, and fed through tubes. Kale had heard the stories, and he had told himself that it was not his business, that one human with a junk freighter could not fight a galactic cartel, and that the smart thing to do was to keep flying and forget the signal. He almost did, but his hand would not move to shut off the beacon, and after a long silence he cursed under his breath and turned the Long Walk toward the drifting barge. The ship was enormous up close, a dark hulk of metal with no running lights and no signs of life, and Kale docked at the lower airlock with a magnetic seal that groaned and hissed as the two ships connected. He pulled on his gear, a worn combat jacket, a sidearm on his hip, a flashlight in his hand, and stepped through the airlock into the barge. The smell hit him first. It was the smell of suffering, a thick and rotten sweetness that clung to the walls and the floor and the recycled air, and Kale had to stop and breathe through his mouth before he could keep walking. The corridors were dark and empty, and his flashlight cut through the black in a narrow beam that showed him what the Syndicate had left behind. Rows and rows of containment cells, dozens of them on each side, their doors hanging open, and their floors stained with things he did not want to identify. Every cell was empty. It looked like the crew had evacuated in a hurry, taking their cargo with them to be sold elsewhere, or dumped in deep space where no one would find the evidence. And Kale felt a slow and heavy anger building in his chest as he walked through the abandoned prison. He checked cell after cell and found nothing but chains and stains and silence. Reached the lowest deck, the very bottom of the barge, where the lights had failed completely and the air was thin and cold. And there, in the last cell at the end of the corridor, his flashlight found her. She was chained to the floor with gravity shackles around her wrists and ankles, thick bands of metal that hummed with energy and held her flat against the ground so she could not stand or sit or even turn over. And around her neck was a neurosuppression collar, a device Kale recognized from his military days, designed to block psychic abilities and cause constant low-level pain to keep the wearer compliant. She was Silithari. Kale knew the species by reputation, a peaceful people from a world called Silithara, known across the galaxy for their empathic abilities and their bioluminescent skin that glowed with soft and shifting colors depending on their emotions. A species so gentle that they had no word for war in their language. Glow. Her skin was dull and gray, covered in scars both old and new, and she was so thin that Kale could see every bone beneath her flesh, and her eyes were closed, and her breathing was so shallow that at first he thought she was dead. He knelt beside her and said, "Hey," in a voice that was softer than he expected from himself, and her eyes opened. They were violet, deep and wide, and filled with a terror so raw that Kale felt it like a punch to the chest, and she flinched away from him with a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a whimper, but something worse than both. She expected him to hurt her. That was the thing that broke something inside Cale Maddox. Not the chains, not the scars, not the collar, but the absolute certainty in her eyes that every hand that reached for her would bring pain. "I am not going to hurt you," he said, and he knew that those words meant nothing, because every monster in the galaxy probably said the same thing. So he did not say anything else. He just pulled out his tools and started working on the shackles. The gravity shackles were military grade, and it took him 20 minutes to crack the first one, and during those 20 minutes, the woman watched him with those violet eyes, and did not move, and did not speak, and barely breathed. When the first shackle released her left wrist, she pulled her arm to her chest and held it there like a broken wing, and Cale moved to the next one. One by one he removed them, the shackles on her wrists, the shackles on her ankles, and finally he reached for the neurosuppression collar around her neck. He hesitated, because he knew that removing it could cause a neural backlash if it had been on too long, but leaving it on would kill her slowly and painfully, and that was not a choice at all. He disabled the collar and pulled it away from her neck, and she gasped, a deep and shuddering breath like a drowning person, breaking the surface, and then she collapsed. Cale caught her before she hit the floor, and she weighed almost nothing, like holding a bundle of sticks wrapped in cloth, and he lifted her in his arms and carried her through the dark corridors of the slave barge, past the empty cells and the stained floors and the ghosts of everyone who had suffered here before her. He carried her through the airlock and onto the long walk, and he laid her down on his own bunk and covered her with every blanket he had. She was unconscious now, her breathing a little stronger, and in the dim light of his cabin, Cale saw something, the faintest flicker of light beneath her skin, a tiny pulse of pale blue that appeared for just a moment near her collarbone, and then faded. A Silithari's glow was tied to their life force, he remembered, and the fact that any light remained at all meant she was still fighting. He did not know her name or her story, or how long she had been chained in that cell. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty, as he sat down in his cockpit and set a course away from the Veshan corridor, at maximum speed. The Dralvathi Syndicate was going to come looking for their property, and when they did, they were going to find something they had never encountered before. A human who had decided that this woman was not property, had never been property, and would never be property again. And humans, as the galaxy had not yet learned, were very difficult to stop once they had made up their minds. The long walk jumped to faster-than-light speed, and the slave barge disappeared behind them. And in the bunk, the Silithari woman slept, and the faintest glow pulsed beneath her skin, like a candle that refused to go out in the dark. For 2 days, the Silithari woman did not speak, and did not eat, and did not look at Cale Maddox. She lay on his bunk, with her face turned toward the wall, and her arms wrapped around herself, and she flinched every time his boots made a sound on the metal floor of the ship. Cale did not push her. He had seen this before, not in aliens, but in humans, in the soldiers he had served with, during the border conflicts on Earth's outer colonies, the ones who had been captured and held and broken in ways that did not always leave visible scars. And he knew that the worst thing you could do to someone in that state was to demand that they recover on your schedule. So, he gave her space. He slept in the cockpit, curled up in his pilot chair with a jacket thrown over himself, and every few hours he would walk quietly to the doorway of the cabin and leave something on the floor. A cup of water, a plate of food, a folded blanket. He never stepped inside. Reached for her. He just left the offering and walked away, and sometimes he would talk while he did it, not to her exactly, but near her, in a voice that was calm and steady, and asked nothing in return. "Ship is running fine," he would say, as he set down a cup of broth. "We are about 4 days out from the nearest station, and I figure we can resupply there and get you some actual medical attention, because I am going to be honest with you, my first aid skills are not great." Or he would sit in the corridor outside the cabin, with his back against the wall, and talk about Earth. "It is mostly water," he said to the empty air, while she lay silent on the other side of the doorway. "Big blue planet. Nothing special really, not compared to some of the worlds out here, but the sunsets are something else. The way the light comes through the clouds at the end of the day and turns everything gold and red. I used to sit on the roof of my building back in New Montreal and just watch it happen, and for a few minutes, everything felt like it was going to be okay." He talked about his ship, and how he had won it in a card game from a drunk Velmari trader, who had bet more than he could afford. And he talked about the time he accidentally flew through a comet tail, and the whole hull lit up like a firework. And he talked about the stray cat he had kept as a kid, and how it used to sleep on his chest and purr so loud it vibrated his ribs. He never asked her questions. He never demanded answers. He just let his voice fill the silence, so she could hear what a person sounded like when they wanted nothing from her. On the morning of the third day, Cale left a plate of food at the doorway, and turned to walk back to the cockpit. And a voice behind him said, "Why?" He stopped. It was barely a whisper, rough and cracked from disuse. But it was a voice, and it was hers, and Cale turned around slowly, and saw her sitting up on the bunk, for the first time. Her violet eyes watching him from across the dim cabin. "Why what?" he asked gently. "Why do you not sell me?" she said, and the question was so matter-of-fact and so empty of hope that it hurt worse than anything Cale had seen on that barge. He leaned against the doorframe and looked at her and said, "Because you are not something to be sold." She stared at him for a long time, and he could see that she was searching for the lie, searching for the angle, searching for the trap. Because in her world, every act of kindness was a transaction, and every gentle hand was just waiting for the right moment to become a fist. She did not find what she was looking for. "My name is Vailra," she said quietly. "Vailra Syntheris." "Cale," he said. "Cale Maddox." She reached for the plate of food and she ate. It was not much, a few bites of protein paste and some dried fruit, but it was the first time she had eaten willingly in days, and Cale felt something loosen in his chest that he had not realized was tight. Over the next 2 days, Vailra began to talk. Not all at once, but in fragments, in small pieces that she offered like someone testing whether the ground beneath them would hold. She told him that she was from Silithara, a world in the inner spiral where her people lived in cities of light, where buildings were grown from living crystal, and the air itself hummed with the shared emotions of millions of Silithari, connected through their empathic bonds. She told him that the Dralvathi had come when she was barely an adult, warships dropping from the sky onto a world that had no weapons and no army and no concept of invasion, and they had taken thousands of her people in a single night. She told him what they had used her for. She was an empathic siphon. The wealthy and powerful beings of the galaxy, the crime lords, the corrupt officials, the corporate overlords, carried inside them enormous amounts of guilt and rage and self-hatred that they did not want to feel, and they would pay vast sums to have a Silithari absorb those emotions, to literally pull the darkness out of their minds and take it into themselves. The process was agony. Every session felt like swallowing poison, like drowning in someone else's worst memories. And over time it burned out the empathic channels in a Silithari's mind, the way acid burned through metal, leaving scars that never healed. "They used me for years," Vailra said, her voice flat and distant. "Hundreds of sessions, hundreds of minds, and I felt everything they did not want to feel. Every terrible thing they had done, every person they had hurt, I carried all of it inside me until there was almost nothing left of who I was." Cale sat on the floor of the corridor and listened and said nothing. because there was nothing to say. When my channels began to fail, they tried to force more sessions, and I started to break. She continued. I could not absorb anymore. I could not function, and when a siphon breaks, they become useless. And useless things are not worth feeding. They left you on that barge to die, Kale said. Yes, Valra said. They left me because I was no longer profitable, and in the syndicate there is no worse crime than being unprofitable. Kale's hands were shaking, and he pressed them flat against his knees to stop the trembling. But it did not work, because the trembling was not in his hands. It was deeper than that. It was in the core of him, where something hot and furious was burning like a reactor that had lost its containment. He did not say anything about what he was feeling, but he did not need to. Valra was an empath. Even with her channels damaged, even with the scars of 1,000 forced sessions carved into her mind, she could still feel the emotions of the person sitting 3 feet away from her. And what she felt, coming from Kale Maddox, in that moment, made her go very still. It was rage. But it was not rage directed at her. It was not the cold and selfish anger of someone who had been inconvenienced. It was a burning and righteous fury that roared like a fire inside this human's chest, and it was aimed entirely at the people who had hurt her. No one had ever been angry on her behalf before. In all her years of captivity, through every hand that had used her and discarded her, through every session that had stripped away another piece of her soul, not a single being in the entire galaxy had ever looked at what was done to her and felt fury, not for themselves but for her. Valra Syntheris looked at the human sitting on the floor of his battered ship with his hands shaking and his jaw clenched and his eyes bright with an anger that burned like a star, and something inside her that had been dark for a very long time flickered. A soft glow appeared on her skin, pale blue, barely visible, like moonlight through water, and it pulsed once near her heart and then faded. But it had been there. For the first time in months her light had come back, and it had come back because of the fury of a human who could not accept that the galaxy had looked at her suffering and shrugged. Kale did not notice the glow because he was staring at his own hands and trying to breathe. But far behind them, in the dark space they had left behind, a syndicate tracker drone locked onto the fading energy signature of the long walk and began to follow. Threshold Station hung in the void like a tumor on the face of the galaxy, a massive and ugly structure built from the welded corpses of decommissioned warships, home to smugglers and black market dealers and fugitives from a dozen species who had nowhere else to go. It was not a good place, but it was the closest place, and Valra needed medical help that Kale could not provide with his basic first aid kit and his limited knowledge of Silithari biology. He docked the long walk in a lower bay, where the security cameras had been broken for years, and helped Valra down the ramp with his arm around her shoulders, because she was still too weak to walk far on her own. She wore a hooded cloak he had found in his storage locker, pulled low over her face to hide the gray and scarred skin that would identify her as Silithari to anyone who knew what to look for, and she walked with her head down, and her body pressed close to his side, like a small animal trying to disappear. The station was loud and crowded, and it stank of engine grease and alien cooking, and the sour chemical smell of cheap intoxicants, and Kale moved through the crowds with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years in places like this, keeping one hand on Valra's arm and the other near his sidearm. He took her to a clinic on the station's mid-level, a cramped and cluttered room behind a noodle shop where a Velmari surgeon named Dr. Oreth worked on patients who could not afford to answer questions about where their injuries came from. Oreth was short and round with 4 arms and skin the color of wet clay, and he owed Kale a favor from a job 2 years ago that neither of them talked about. And when Kale brought Valra through his door and pulled back her hood, Oret's 4 eyes went wide. Silithari, he breathed, and then he saw the scars and the neurosuppression burns on her neck, and the way her skin hung loose over her bones, and his professional calm cracked for just a moment before he pulled it back together. He ran his scanners over her, and the results made him go quiet for a long time. The collar did more damage than you can see, Oreth told Kale in the hallway, while Vailra rested on the examination table. Her empathic channels are scarred badly, and some of them are collapsed entirely. And her bioluminescent system is running on almost nothing. She is alive, but she is running on fumes. Can you fix her? Kale asked. I can stabilize her and repair some of the surface damage, but for a full recovery she needs silitharine. It is a biomaterial that only grows on Silithara, her homeworld, and it is the only thing that can regenerate damaged empathic tissue in her species. Then we go to Silithara, Kale said, as if it were that simple. Silithara is in Syndicate-controlled space, Oreth said carefully. You would have to fly through their territory to reach it. Is what we do. Oreth looked at him with the expression of someone who was watching another person walk off a cliff and could not decide whether to admire them or pity them. I will do what I can for her today, Oreth said. Come back in 4 hours. Kale left the clinic and went to resupply fuel cells, food, water, ammunition. And he was in a corridor on the station's lower level, carrying a crate of provisions on his shoulder, when a shadow fell across his path, and he stopped. The being in front of him was enormous. Dren Vasek stood 7 feet tall, and was built like a wall of dark green scales and cybernetic enhancements, with a jaw full of teeth that were not designed for chewing food, and eyes that were the color of old blood. And he wore the black and silver insignia of the Dralvathi Syndicate on his chest like a badge of honor. Behind him stood 4 enforcers, each one armed and armored, and watching Kale with the bored confidence of predators, who had never met anything they could not kill. Kale Maddox, Vasek said, and his voice was deep and smooth like oil poured over gravel. Human, salvager, registered to the vessel called the Long Walk, currently docked in Bay 47. Kale set down his crate slowly and straightened up and looked at the Dralvathi enforcer without expression. You have something that belongs to the Syndicate, Vasek said. A Silithari female, registry number 774, listed as inventory on a transport barge that you illegally boarded in the Veshun corridor. She is not inventory, Kale said. Vasek tilted his massive head to one side and studied Kale with what might have been curiosity. She is registered property under Dralvathi commerce law, legally acquired and legally owned, and her removal from a syndicate vessel constitutes theft. She is not property, Kale said again. Vasek reached into his coat and produced a credit chip and held it out between 2 clawed fingers. 50,000 galactic standard. That is more than your ship is worth. More than you will earn in 5 years of scraping junk from dead ships. Take it and walk away, and we will forget this happened. Kale looked at the credit chip and then looked at Vasek. No, he said. Something shifted in Vasek's eyes. Not anger exactly, but confusion. The genuine bewilderment of a creature who operated in a world where everything and everyone had a price, and who had just encountered something that did not fit into that framework. 100,000, Vasek said. No. You are a human, Vasek said slowly, as if explaining something to a child. Your species is small and fragile and short-lived, and you have no allies in this sector, and no government that will come looking for you. The Syndicate has a fleet and an army, and resources beyond anything you can imagine. You cannot win this. Probably not, Kale agreed. Why? Because she asked me why I did not sell her, Kale said. And I want to keep being the kind of person who does not have to think about the answer. Vasek stared at him for a long moment, and then the confusion in his eyes hardened into something cold and professional. The Syndicate does not ask twice, Vasek said. Then don't, Kale replied. Vasek moved fast for something his size. His cybernetic arm shot forward in a blur of metal and servos aimed at Kale's throat. But Kale was already moving. He had been a combat operative in the Earth Colonial Defense Force for 6 years before he became a salvager. And the things they had taught him in those years were not the kind of things you forgot. They were written into muscle and bone and reflex, and they came back now like a language he had never stopped speaking. He ducked under Vasek's arm and drove his elbow into the joint where the cybernetics met flesh, and heard something crack. 4 enforcers were on him, and the corridor became a blur of violence. Kale was not bigger or stronger or tougher than any of them. The Dralvathi were reptilian predators with natural armor and claws that could tear through metal. But he was faster than they expected, and more vicious than they were prepared for, because the Dralvathi fought to dominate, and Kale fought to survive, and those were very different things. He broke the first enforcer's knee with a kick that used the wall as leverage, put the second one down with 3 precise strikes to the nerve cluster under its jaw, took a claw across his ribs from the third that opened his skin in a line of fire, and then grabbed the fourth by its weapon arm and used its own momentum to throw it into Vasek. Vasek came at him again, and Kale met him head-on, grabbing the cybernetic R with both hands and twisting with everything he had until the servos screamed, and the arm bent at an angle it was not designed for. Vasek roared in pain and dropped to one knee. Kale stood over him, bleeding from his ribs and breathing hard, and the corridor had gone silent around them, because a dozen species had stopped to watch a human, a small and fragile and unremarkable human, put a syndicate enforcer on the ground. "Tell your bosses something for me," Kale said quietly. "She is not for sale, and neither am I." He picked up his crate of provisions and walked away and did not look back. 4 hours later, he collected Vailra from the clinic, where Orith had done what he could, and they moved quickly through the station back to the long walk. Kale fired the engines and pulled away from Threshold before the syndicate could reorganize. Vailra saw the blood on his shirt and the makeshift bandage on his ribs, and her eyes went wide. "What happened?" she whispered. "Nothing important," Kale said. "You are lying. I can feel it." He paused and then said, "By you?" And I said no, and they did not like that answer very much. "You fought them," she said, and it was not a question, because she could feel the adrenaline still humming in his blood and the pain radiating from his ribs, and underneath all of it, the same steady and stubborn determination that burned in him like an engine that never shut off. "Why?" she asked, and it was the same question she had asked before, but it meant something different now. Kale looked at her and said, "Because someone should have a long time ago." Vailra's skin flickered, and a wave of pale blue light moved across her arms and her neck and her face, stronger than before, and she looked down at her own hands as if seeing them for the first time. "No one in the galaxy thinks the way you do," she said softly. Kale set a course for Silithari space, and said, "Maybe the galaxy has not met enough humans. Not a single ship, not a patrol, but a full pursuit formation. 12 warships armed with weapons that could crack the hull of a cruiser, led by the personal flagship of warlord Thixendral, the regional overlord who had built his empire on the broken backs of trafficked species, and who considered the escape of a single Silithari woman to be an insult that could not be allowed to stand. Thixendral was old, even by Dralvathi standards, a massive and ancient predator whose scales had darkened to black with age, and whose cybernetic eye glowed red in the dim light of his command bridge. And he had not personally led a hunt in years, because there had been no prey worth his attention. Until now. Not because of Vailra. She was nothing to him, a burned-out asset, a number on a ledger, but because of the message her rescue sent to everyone watching, that the syndicate could be defied, that their property could be taken, that a single human on a junk freighter could spit in their eye, their face, and walk away. That could not be allowed. So the fleet moved through the Veshin corridor like a net being drawn tight, scanning every sector and every lane and every shadow for the energy signature of a battered freighter called the Long Walk. And Cale Maddox ran. He pushed his ship to its limits and beyond, using every trick he had learned in 6 years of military service and 3 years of flying the Outer Rim. And the things he did with the Long Walk made the Syndicate navigators shake their heads in disbelief. He flew into a nebula where the radiation levels were high enough to fry unshielded electronics, and he survived because he had personally rewired his ship's shielding 2 years ago with salvaged military-grade components that he had installed backwards, because the manual was in a language he could not read, and it had somehow worked better that way. He used gravitational slingshots around dead stars, whipping the Long Walk around the edges. Gravity wells at speeds and angles that no sane pilot would attempt, cutting days off his travel time at the risk of being torn apart by tidal forces. He ran silent through a debris field left over from an ancient war, shutting down every system on the ship except life support, and drifting like a dead thing among the wreckage, while Syndicate scout ships passed within kilometers of his hull and did not see him. Velra sat beside him through all of it, gripping the arms of the co-pilot chair, watching this human navigate impossible dangers with a calm and focused intensity that she could feel radiating from him like heat from a furnace. He was afraid, she could sense that clearly, but his fear was buried deep beneath layers of determination and stubbornness and something else that she did not have a word for in her language. Something uniquely human that she had never encountered in any other species. It was the absolute refusal to quit. Not bravery exactly, because bravery implied the absence of fear, and Cale was full of fear, but he simply did not allow his fear to make his decisions for him. He acknowledged it, and then he moved forward anyway, as if the fear was just weather, just something to walk through, on the way to where he needed to go. During a quiet stretch between pursuits, when the Long Walk drifted in the shadow of a gas giant, and the Syndicate fleet was a full sector behind them, Velra told Cale about Silithara. She told him about the cities of light, towers of living crystal that grew from the ground and resonated with the emotions of the people who lived inside them, so that the buildings themselves would glow and hum and sing, and the whole city was like a single living organism, breathing and feeling together. She told him about the way her people communicated, not with words alone, but with light and feeling, their bioluminescence shifting and flowing in patterns that carried meaning deeper than any spoken language could express, a conversation of the soul that happened in colors and warmth. She told him about the night the Dralvathi came. There were no warnings, she said, her voice quiet and steady in the dim cockpit. Our world had no weapons, no military, no defense grid. We had never needed them, because we had never imagined that anyone would want to hurt us on that scale. The ships came down, and the soldiers came out, and they started taking people, just grabbing them from the streets, from their homes, from their families, and we could not fight back. Why? Cale asked, not with judgment, but with a genuine need to understand. Because we are empaths, Velra said. When a Silithari tries to harm another living being, we feel their pain as our own. We feel their fear, their suffering, everything. And the more we try to fight, the more we feel, and the more we feel, the less we can function. She looked at her hands. The raiders knew this. They had studied us, and they used it against us. Some of them would deliberately hurt themselves in front of our people because they knew the empathic backlash would paralyze us. Our greatest gift was turned into our greatest weakness. Our ability to feel was used as a weapon against us, and we could not stop it, because stopping it would have required us to stop being who we are. The cockpit was silent for a long moment. Then Cale said something that made Velra look at him with an expression she had never worn before. That is not weakness, he said. his voice rough and certain. "What you just described, feeling everything, carrying the pain of others even when it destroys you, being unable to shut it off, that is not a flaw in your species. That is the hardest thing any living being could be asked to do." He turned to look at her. Every other species in this galaxy can turn off their empathy when it gets inconvenient. They can look at suffering and shrug and walk away. Your people cannot do that. You are forced to feel everything all the time, and you still chose to be kind. You still built cities of light instead of fortresses. That is not weakness, Veilra. That is a burden no one else in this galaxy is strong enough to carry. Veilra stared at him, and then something inside her broke open. Not the breaking of damage, but the breaking of a dam, the release of something that had been held back for so long that she had forgotten it was there. She wept. Not the silent and suppressed tears of captivity, but real and heaving sobs that shook her entire body, the grief of years and years of suffering pouring out of her like water from a cracked vessel. And as she cried, her skin began to glow. Not the faint and flickering pulse that Kale had seen before, but a real and steady light, blue and violet and white, flowing across her skin in waves and patterns, like aurora, moving across a night sky. The long walk was filled with color and warmth, and the light of a Silithari who was remembering what it felt like to be alive. Kale did not touch her, and he did not speak. He just sat beside her, and let her cry, and let her glow, and kept the ship steady in the dark. When the tears finally stopped, Veilra looked at him with her luminous eyes, and said, "You see things that no one else sees." "I just see what is there," Kale said. They reached the border of Silithari space 2 days later, and that is when the Syndicate fleet caught them. 12 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel, in a formation that blocked every route to Silithara. And Warlord Thixandral's flagship, a massive black dreadnought called the Harvester, sat at the center of the blockade, like a predator waiting at the mouth of a burrow. They were outgunned by a factor of 100 to 1. Kale looked at the tactical display, and knew there was no way through, and no way around, and no way out. So he did the one thing no one expected. He opened a broadband channel. Not a targeted message, but an open transmission, unencrypted, broadcasting on every frequency, to every ship, and every station, and every receiver within range. And he began to talk. He told the galaxy what the Dralvathi Syndicate had done to the Silithari people. He described the raids, the trafficking, the empathic siphoning, the systematic exploitation of a peaceful species whose only crime was being unable to fight back without destroying themselves. He named names: Thixandral, the Syndicate bosses, the wealthy clients who had paid to use Silithari as emotional garbage dumps. He transmitted Veilra's medical scans as evidence: the scarred empathic channels, the neurosuppression burns, the malnutrition, all of it broadcast to anyone with a receiver. And then he said, "You all knew, every government, every trade authority, every species in this sector, knew what was happening to the Silithari, and you looked away because it was not your problem, and because the Syndicate was too powerful, and because it was easier to pretend you did not see it. I am not looking away," he said. "I am one human on one ship, and I cannot stop this fleet. But I can make sure the galaxy sees what is happening right here and right now. You can kill me, but you cannot unbroadcast this signal." The transmission went out across the sector, like a ripple spreading across still water. And on the bridge of the Harvester, Warlord Thixandral ordered his fleet to destroy a long walk. The first ship arrived 30 seconds before the Syndicate opened fire. It was a human cargo hauler, a fat and ugly vessel called the Betty White, that had no weapons and no armor, and no business being anywhere near a military engagement. And it dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly between the Long Walk and the Syndicate fleet, and just sat there like a wall of rusty metal and stubborn defiance. Then came another, and another. They came in ones and twos, dropping out of the dark in flashes of displaced light. Human ships, all of them, traders and salvagers and prospectors and freight runners, scattered across the outer rim, who had heard Kale's broadcast on the open channel, and had turned their ships around and come. They were not warships, they were junk haulers and mining barges and converted passenger liners, and not one of them had the firepower to scratch the paint on a syndicate cruiser, but they came anyway. Arranged themselves around the long walk, like a shield made of scrap metal and determination, and their combined tactical value was approximately 0. But that was not the point. The point was that they were there. And then the non-human ships started arriving. A Velmari medical frigate, with the universal symbol of healing painted on its hull, its captain broadcasting that it was there to provide humanitarian aid, and that firing on a medical vessel was a war crime under Galactic Convention. 3 Kesathi trade ships, whose captains had lost family members to syndicate trafficking a decade ago, and who had been waiting for someone, anyone, to stand up first. A Marathi cruiser, an actual warship with actual weapons, whose commander announced on open channel that she had heard the broadcast and that she was present as an independent observer, and that any hostile action against civilian vessels would be documented and transmitted to the Galactic Council. And more were coming. The communication channels were alive with voices and signals from ships still in transit, all responding to the signal of a single human who had refused to be silent. On the bridge of the Harvester, Warlord Fikesandral watched the tactical display fill with new contacts and felt something he had not felt in decades. Uncertainty. Not fear. Fikesand had crushed larger forces than this, and the ragtag collection of civilian ships posed no real military threat. But the broadcast was the problem. Kale's transmission was still going out, still being received, still spreading across the sector, and every ship that arrived was proof that people were listening. If Fikesand destroyed them all, it would not matter, because the signal was already out there. The evidence was already in 1,000 databases, and killing a fleet of civilian ships on an open broadcast would turn the syndicate from a tolerated evil into a galactic crisis. The most corrupt governments would be forced to address. But Fikesand had not built his empire by backing down, and the cold and calculating part of his mind told him that showing weakness here would cost him more than showing cruelty. So he gave the order. Destroy them all, and start with the human ship. The Harvester's weapons powered up and targeted the long walk. In the cockpit, Kale saw the targeting lock on his console, and he knew what was coming, and he had approximately 45 seconds to make a decision. He looked at Velra. She was glowing, really glowing, her whole body illuminated with shifting patterns of blue and violet and silver that moved across her skin like living light, and her eyes were bright and clear, and she was looking back at him with an expression that held no fear, only a profound and luminous gratitude that filled the cockpit with warmth. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." "We are not done yet," Kale said. He turned to his console and began working with the speed and precision of someone who had been planning for this moment since the fleet appeared on his sensors. He programmed the autopilot. He armed the collision alert. He overrode every safety protocol on the Long Walk's navigation system. And then he reached under the console and activated the escape pod. Not the main pod, but the secondary one that he had salvaged from a military ship 2 years ago. The one with its own life support, an emergency beacon, and enough thrust to reach the Silithari border. "What are you doing?" Velra said. "Getting you home," Kale said. Before she could argue, he reached across and pressed the emergency release, and the co-pilot seat, which was also the secondary escape pod, because Kale had built his ship with the understanding that one day he might need to get someone out in a hurry, detached from the cockpit floor, and the section of hull behind it blew open, and Velra was launched into space in a sealed and pressurized capsule aimed directly at Silithari territory. She screamed his name, but the pod was already moving, accelerating away from the long walk, on a trajectory that would carry her across the border in minutes. Kale watched her pod disappear on his screen, and then he turned the long walk toward the harvester and pushed the engines to maximum. The freighter was small and old, and held together with patches and hope, but it was fast when it needed to be, and Kale aimed it at the flagship's engine array, the massive cluster of drives at the stern of the harvester that powered the dreadnought's weapons and shields and faster-than-light capability. The Syndicate gunners fired, and shots tore through the Long Walk's hull, blowing holes in the cargo bay and the living quarters, and the corridor where Kale had sat on the floor and listened to Vailra tell him about her world. And the ship shook and screamed, and began to come apart around him. Kale kept his hands on the controls and his eyes on the target. At the last possible moment, half a second before impact, he hit the ejection system. The pilot's seat rocketed upward through an emergency hatch in the cockpit roof, and Kale was thrown into the void in a pressurized flight suit with nothing but a locator beacon and the air in his suit. And below him, the Long Walk, his home for 3 years, his livelihood, the ship he had won in a card game and loved like a living thing, slammed into the harvester's engine array at full speed. The explosion was enormous. The Long Walk ceased to exist, and it took half of the harvester's engine section with it. A cascade of detonations that ripped through the flagship's stern and killed its primary drives and sent it spinning slowly in the dark, crippled and burning. The Syndicate fleet broke formation, without the flagship's coordination and without Thixan's direct command. The harvester had lost power and communications in the blast. The remaining warships fell into confusion, and the captains who had been loyal out of fear rather than conviction began to calculate their odds and did not like the numbers. 3 ships broke away and fled, then 4 more. The conscripted crews, many of them trafficked species themselves, who had been forced into service, saw the chaos and saw an opportunity. And on at least 2 Syndicate vessels, the crews turned on their officers in mutinies that had been waiting to happen for years. The blockade collapsed, and in the wreckage field between the scattered fleet and the border of Silithari space, Vailra's escape pod was picked up by a Silithari rescue vessel, the first of its kind to operate near the border in years, launched in response to Kale's broadcast. When they opened the pod, they found a Silithari woman glowing brighter than anyone they had ever seen, her light filling the rescue bay with colors that made the crew stop and stare, and she was saying one word over and over: Kale. They told her he was gone, that no one could have survived that impact, and she shook her head and closed her eyes and reached out with her damaged but still functioning empathic abilities, reaching across the cold distance of space, searching for a specific emotional signature, that stubborn and burning determination that she would recognize anywhere. She found it. Faint and weak and flickering with pain, but alive, unmistakably alive, somewhere in the debris field, a human heartbeat wrapped in a pressurized flight suit, drifting among the wreckage of his own ship. She told the rescue crew where to look, and they found him. Kale Maddox was unconscious when they pulled him from the void, his suit punctured in 2 places, his body broken in more ways than the medics could count without a full scan. And he was closer to death than any human should be able to survive, but he was breathing. 3 weeks later, Kale opened his eyes. He was in a bed that was softer than anything he had ever slept on, in a room made of living crystal that hummed with a gentle warmth, and the light coming through the walls was not artificial, but the natural glow of a Silithari city, filtered through crystal into soft and shifting colors that moved like water. Vailor was sitting beside him, She was transformed. Not the gray and broken creature he had found in that cell, but a woman made of light, her skin glowing with deep and rich patterns of blue and violet and gold that flowed across her like a living painting. Her violet eyes clear and bright and full of something that Kale had never seen directed at him before by anyone in the galaxy. She was whole. Not completely. Oreth had been right that she needed Silitharan to fully heal, and she had received it here on Silithara. But more than that, the deadness behind her eyes was gone. Gone. Replaced by a fierce and quiet vitality that made her look like an entirely different person from the one he had carried off that barge. "You are awake," she said. "Apparently," Kale said, and his voice was a wreck, but it was his, and it worked. "You destroyed your ship," she said. "She went out fighting," Kale said. "The long walk would have wanted it that way." Vailra shook her head slowly, and her glow intensified. "You humans are insane." "We get that a lot." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "My people have been talking about what you did. The broadcast reached every corner of the sector. The Galactic Council has opened an investigation into the Syndicate. 3 governments have frozen Dralvathi assets. There are rescue missions being organized for trafficked Silithari across the rim." She paused. "One human on one ship, and you changed everything." "I did not change anything," Kale said. "I just made noise. Everyone else did the changing." "That is what you think," Vailra said. "But you are wrong. My people have a word for someone like you. In our language it is Vail Kirin." "What does it mean?" "It does not translate perfectly," she said, and her light shifted to a warm and deep gold. "The closest meaning is the fire that refuses to go out, the flame that burns in the dark when every other light has been extinguished, the one that keeps going, not because it is the strongest, but because it simply will not stop." Kale looked at her, and a small and tired smile crossed his face. "On Earth we just call that being stubborn," he said. Vailra laughed. It was a real laugh, bright and sudden and startled out of her like a bird taking flight, and it was the first time she had laughed in years, and the sound of it filled the crystal room with light, because a Silithari's joy was not just sound, but luminescence, and her glow blazed so bright that the walls of the room caught it and amplified it, and for a moment the entire building sang with color. Kale lay in his bed, in a city of light, on a world he had nearly died to reach, broken and battered, and without a ship, or a plan, or a single credit to his name, and he watched a woman he had pulled from the dark laugh with her whole body glowing like a star. And he thought that it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Far away, across the sector, the broadcast was still spreading, and ships were still moving, and the galaxy was still changing, slowly and imperfectly and not all at once, because one human had looked at a woman in chains and decided that he could not walk away. They had called his species fragile and short-lived and unremarkable. They were right about all of it, but they forgot one thing.